Prabhupada was just beginning to enjoy his first experience of success in America since his arrival in September of 1965. Behind him now was the first experiment, the testing ground in Butler, Pennsylvania. Behind him now was the long winter, 1965-66, November, December, January, February, March, uptown at 72nd Street, Dr. Mishra. Those were difficult times. Prabhupada was not allowed to lecture by Dr. Mishra. Prabhupada wrote many letters to friends and contacts in India, asking for financial help to build a Radha Krishna temple in New York City. But he received nothing but discouragement and rejection. That was behind him now. And behind him now was the slightly improved conditions of living in an artist's loft, where he had his first congregation of people who chanted with him. Those were musicians and artists who lived on the Lower East Side, who came for the music, not the philosophy. But this was in the worst neighborhood of America, Bowery, Skid Row, and Prabhupada dared to live there. That was behind him also, because through his Bowery congregation friends, they found him a better place on the Lower East Side at 26 Second Avenue. And now he was located in the midst of the growing population of what would be known in a little while as the hippies of America. And Prabhupada preached with great happiness and success. Krishna Peshtaya Putale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine. He quickly had a new core of followers after he moved to 26 Second Avenue. I knew of 26 Second Avenue for many months. It used to be a gift store. There was a sign above the window, matchless gifts. And I passed it every day, coming home from my work at the welfare office on 5th Street, going to my apartment, which was south of 26 Second Avenue. I used to glance in the window at the gifts. One day I was walking by, and I noticed they had gone out of business. The place was deserted. There was a little piece of paper in the window, taped, and it said, "Classes in Bhagavad Gita, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 7 p.m. Transcendental sound vibration." So this was the new establishment. I was interested in the Gita, and the phrase transcendental sound vibration intrigued me. So I went the first night, and I never stopped coming. Another man, Howard, who later became Hayagriva, met Prabhupada alone on the street. He said to Prabhupada, "Are you from India?" And Prabhupada smiled and said, "Yes, are you?" Howard said, "No, I'm American, but I just came back from India." And Prabhupada and he had a conversation, and Prabhupada took him to his new place, 26 Second Avenue, and said, "Do you think this is a good location?" He said, "Yes, it seems to be good." He said, "Will you come and bring your friends?" And Howard said, "Yes." Howard lived on Mott Street in Chinatown with a group of roommates, and they were all interested in spiritual ideas. They later became devotees by the names of Kirtanananda, Umapati, and a friend who didn't live there but hung out there, Achyutananda. So Howard brought all these friends and they became part of the new corps. There were also a few of the Bowery congregation who came. Most of them dropped out and didn't make the transfer over to the Lower East Side. But a few came. One was Michael Grant, who found the place and who later became Mukunda, and also Carl Jurgens and James Green. These and a few others formed the new corps, people who were interested in finding a guru and were serious seekers. There were a few others, as well as people who weren't so committed, who came to the evening programs, and some people came for the first time, repeatedly. I quickly became a corps member myself. The condition of the storefront at this time was that it was bare. There were no pictures. There was no elevated seat for Swamiji. There were just two naked light bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and on the floor, spread around, thin straw oriental mats. So Swamiji sat on the same level as everybody else. People gathered before 7 o'clock, and Swamiji used to enter sharply at 7 p.m. My first impression of him was striking. He was certainly Indian, but he wasn't an ordinary man. He was a holy man dressed in saffron robes. It was summer and it was warm, and he didn't wear a shirt or kurta. He just wore a sannyas top piece that left his shoulder and chest bare, and he wore a dhoti, and his feet were in white pointy shoes. He was elderly, but he was very erect in his posture and wasn't feeble-looking. He was very healthy-looking. He had the Vaishnav tilak marks on his body, and he stepped out of his shoes and smiled to see Howard, who he met from the street, and said, "So you've brought your friends?" And Howard said, "Yes," in a loud voice. He asked us to sit, and he gave out hand symbols. Without any introductory speech, he began chanting. First, however, he showed us the beat to keep with the hand symbols. It was 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And he played, and we played after him. Then he chanted Sanskrit prayers for a few minutes, and then began the Hare Krishna mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. He turned toward us and he said, "Chant." Only a few of us knew the chant, and we stumbled in trying to follow him in a chorus. But after a few rounds, we caught on, and we started a response, lead and response kirtan. It built up, and we got into it. Most of us, including myself, had taken LSD numerous times. We took it to expand our consciousness and to find God or the absolute truth. It was not like in later years when acid was taken just for kicks. At this time, the takers of LSD were seekers. There was a valor in our daring to do it despite it being forbidden. So we applied the same adventure seeking to trying this chanting. We wanted to see what we could get out of it. Swamiji knew that we had this wrong attitude. He had experienced it with his group on the Bowery, but he tolerated it and accepted it. He felt that eventually, if people chanted, they'd get purified and come to an understanding of what the chant actually was. So he let us trip out on the chanting and welcomed our chanting. As we began, people gathered at the front door. There were some little Puerto Rican girls, and in the distance there was a dog barking, and trucks and cars were rumbling by on 2nd Avenue. So a boy got up to shut the door, but Swamiji said, "Keep the door open, they may come in." Actually, the outdoor noises became subdued by the kirtan. We went on for half an hour. He wasn't giving just a 5-minute sample. He was giving us the full experience. He was in his own inner ecstasy. His head was trembling slightly and moved back and forth. He kept his eyes closed, except sometimes he opened them to look out at us, and he led us in his deep voice. I went beyond boredom and explored the mantra. Most of us were acquainted with the Upanishads and the Gita, although we didn't understand them. But phrases occurred to us like negating illusion, transcending the mind. And I felt fantasies and visions and searched for it and the light and the absolute truth, like I used to on LSD. It was a far-out experience chanting with him. After half an hour, he stopped the kirtan, and the Lower East Side noise returned. He wanted the girls removed from the storefront, so someone asked them to leave. But they would be back because they lived on the street, the little Puerto Rican girls. And nearby there was a big dog chained up. Row, row, row. He couldn't be stopped. And a man was shouting from a window, "Get out of here! Get out of here!" Sometimes somebody would walk past the door and yell in, "What the hell is this?" We got disturbed. The Swami didn't. He tolerated it all. But as soon as he began talking, or rather, as soon as the music stopped, some of the audience got up and rudely left. And as soon as he uttered his first words, some more people left. They didn't want to hear the lecture. But his core group remained. He started lecturing on the Bhagavad Gita about Krishna and Arjuna on a battlefield. We stayed, despite the difficulty in understanding him. He had a heavy Bengali accent, and he used Sanskrit words, and the philosophy was all new to us. But we hung in there. On one of the first nights, into the open door came a Bowery bum, and we detected him immediately by his odor. He was reeking, and he whistled and shouted, "How are you? In a church? I'll be right back." Swamiji said to him, "Don't disturb. Sit down. We are talking seriously." And the man careened out the door. Prabhupada went on with his lecture, but a few minutes later the derelict came back, and he had something in his arms. He moved his way up to the front where Swamiji was, and Swamiji said, "What is this?" He opened the bathroom door next to Swamiji and put some toilet rolls on the floor of the bathroom. And then he put some toilet rolls under the sink in the temple room and some paper towels on top of the sink. When Swamiji saw what he was doing, he said, "Oh, thank you very much." And the bum turned toward Swamiji in the audience, and then he careened out the door. And Swamiji said to us, "Just see, he wanted to do some service. He was not in order, but the natural feeling is there to do service." And he went on to describe how everyone wants to serve. So we looked at each other and thought, this experience is really far out. First playing the hand cymbals, then singing the mantra, then the Swami talking about Krishna and saying we could all become saints, and then even the bum is a saint. It was really far out. And there was a Swami sitting there, completely fearless, sitting on the ground and talking his philosophy. He went on lecturing despite the noises. And then after about half an hour or 40 minutes, he stopped and he asked for questions. Some different people raised their hands. I raised my hand. He recognized me. I said, "Is misery eternal?" I asked this question based on reading the letters of the painter Vincent van Gogh. He had written to his brother that misery was eternal, and I wanted to know the Swami's opinion about this. He said to me, "Yes, misery is eternal. You may break your arm and go to the hospital and get it mended, and then you come out and you break your leg. So there's always some misery in the world." So at first he confirmed Van Gogh's opinion, but then he turned it around and said, "But there's another world where there's no misery, no anxiety. That's the spiritual world." And I was satisfied with this answer and wanted to know more about it. Big bearded Howard raised his hand and said, "You said Buddha was an atheist. What do you mean by that?" We all had a high regard for Buddha, so he was kind of taken back by that remark by the Swami. So Swami explained in an introductory way how Buddha was an incarnation of God in the Vedic scriptures, but he came to stop the animal slaughter, and he had to deny the Vedic sacrifices. So that controversy was settled. A girl asked a question. "When I chant, I see a red light. What is that?" Swamiji replied, "Just keep chanting, it will clear up." He continued answering questions for about 10 minutes. Then we had a second kirtan. Again, the outside noises were subdued. And again, we tripped out. There was one inner core member, Greg, who cried when he chanted. And he asked Swamiji if it was all right. And Swamiji said, "Yes. When you cried, this shows your love for Krishna." So, speaking now, in 2016, 50 years later, we may think that Prabhupada was indulging us hippies in saying that our crying showed love for Krishna. But actually at that time it was easy to love Krishna with the Swami. And one way we could show it was through tears. A boy came forward with a wooden bowl and an apple and a knife, and he gave it to the Swamiji. Swami cut the apple in half, in quarters and eighths, and cut up enough so that everyone had a piece of apple. He had the boy give the apple out to everyone, and he took a piece and popped it into his mouth without touching his fingers to his mouth. He ruminated on it, chewed it with his mouth closed, and then turned toward the sink to his right and spit out the pits which landed right in the sink. He was expert at everything. The first boy to come forward and volunteer more service for the Swami was Keith, who later became Kirtanananda. He moved out of his Mott Street apartment and moved in with the Swami. Swami taught him how to cook in a 3-tiered brass boiler, and he became Swami's houseboy and cook. But after a little while, he expanded his cooking, and he started using big pots and cooked enough for 15 people. And we started this phenomena of daily lunch with Swamiji. It was extraordinary. Even some of the hangers-on in the storefront who weren't very interested in the philosophy would show up punctually at 1 o'clock every day. Swamiji's apartment had 2 rooms. In one room he worked. There was his tin suitcase, battered, from India, on which his little typewriter sat. And he sat on a thin mattress and typed there. And he slept on that mattress. And he used to meet with guests when he didn't have kirtan nights in that room. Then next to it, separated by a window, was another room. This room had wood parquet floors and was bare, except it had a little coffee table at one end. And on that table he had a picture he brought with him from India of the Panchatattva, Lord Chaitanya and his 4 associates. Swamiji would sit there and wave incense to the picture and ring a bell and chant prayers. We didn't know what he was doing, but we came to call it bells. So Kirtanananda, or Keith, brought out the pots and put them on the floor before the table in the picture. And Swamiji led us in a Bengali prayer, and we all bowed down. And then Keith gave out plates and served us all prasadam, as it was called. And there was all hot, good food, rice, vegetables, dal, and big chapatis. Swamiji called them rotis, and he encouraged everyone to eat. He wouldn't let you just sit there and play with your food and not eat. If he saw somebody wasn't eating, he'd call out his name and say, "Eat more, eat more." He wanted us to eat with gusto. And Keith said, "Everyone should take seconds, right, Swamiji?" And Swamiji said, "Yes." Swamiji ate the same thing that we ate, except with one extra. He had a little bowl of milk and a banana, and he would slice the banana on the edge of the bowl so the pieces fell in and he would eat them. In my foolishness, I envied the Swami for having this extra preparation that we didn't have. But I love the food. I had a terrible diet before coming. I used to eat chocolate, donuts, and milk and cookies. And that was all I had. And I was skinny. So this was real food and real nourishing. Although it was unusual to me. When I grew up, we never ate rice. My mother thought rice was for poor people and Chinese. But this was delicious, fluffy, white rice. And I loved it. Swamiji ate with his right hand. He used to mix all the food with his hand. He'd rip off a piece of the chapati and mix it in with the rice and the dal and mix the vegetable in. And keep mixing it all with his fingers and then put it in his mouth without touching his lips. So we followed his example and ate with our right hands. Except there were some spoons for new guests. And it was kind of sloppy eating. We got prasadam down our shirts and mouths. I loved so much going to the lunch at 1 o'clock. And it was convenient for me because I got off work at 1 o'clock from the welfare office on 5th Street. And it was only a 5-minute walk to the storefront. But one day my supervisors called over to me, "Mr. Guarino, you're going to have to stay in for lunch today. You have to work on the Garcia case." So I thought, oh no, I can't go to lunch. So I went to the hall where they had a phone, and I put my money in and called the Swami's number. And he answered, "Hello, Swami." I said, "Swami, this is Steve. Do you remember me?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Swami, I can't come for lunch today. I have to stay in for work. Could you save a plate for me? I'll come at 2. He said, "Yes, I will save a plate for you." I thought that was daring of me to call him personally, but I was so anxious to have the prasadam. So I had to stay in an hour, and then I went over to see him. When I went to his door, he was all alone, and everything was cleared up. The rug was rolled back. The wooden floor was exposed, and I sat on the edge of the floor. And he went and he got a plate for me, and he bent over and he put it on the floor. And I thought this was the way you feed a dog. You put a plate on the floor for him. And then for the first time in my life, I bowed down to him. I bowed at his feet. And he said, "Yes, thank you." And I took my prasadam and was very, very happy. It was a wonderful time coming to eat lunch with the Swami. When we finished eating, we all got up and left him to clean up. We didn't have a concept of the Guru and serving the Guru. But after a few weeks, we caught on and started helping him clean up. And the whole idea of service developed. But the lunch was mainly eating. There was one young boy who was a little younger than the others of us, named Stanley, who sat next to Swamiji. Stanley was eccentric. His mother had come to see the Swami and said that he could live in a storefront if the Swami would personally take care of him. The Swami agreed, and he doted on Stanley. So Stanley had a voracious appetite. He was thin and tall, but he ate like anything. And he would ask the Swami, "Can I have another chapati?" Or Swamiji would say to him, "Stanley, would you like another chapati?" And he would say, "Yes, I would like another one." And he kept taking chapatis until he ate 10 chapatis. And then Swamiji would say, "All right, you've had enough." But he could eat that much. So gradually we learned that you're not supposed to leave the Guru to clean up all the prasadam and the pots. And we stayed and helped him. And the whole concept of service developed, that we each had some service to do for the Swami. My service was typing. I was a typist because I was a writer. That was my vocation before I came. And so I could type. And I had a typewriter chained to my radiator in my apartment. So Swamiji had these stacks of manuscripts tied with saffron in his closet, which Hayagriva had edited. And I typed them up after the editing. When he gave me a big stack, I said, "Swamiji, there's enough here to last me all winter." And he laughed and said, "I have enough typing for you for several lifetimes." He showed me all the stacks of manuscripts that he had. And I also gave money from my job. I had $400 savings in the bank. I planned to use it to go to Canada over the summer and do serious writing. But I took the money out of the bank. And one day when Swamiji was alone, I gave it to him. When he received it, he broke into a wide, candid smile of gratitude, and he thanked me. That probably took care of months of rent. I was standing real close to him as I gave him the money, and he smiled to me. And then I walked from standing next to him a few feet to sitting down and leaning against the wall. And in that distance, Swamiji's face changed, and I looked at him, and instead of smiling at him, he was looking at me very sternly, almost like he wasn't pleased with me, and I was shocked. And it was as if he was saying, "You have given your money, but when are you going to surrender to Krishna?" He didn't want me to be puffed up by the fact that I had been a big donor. And other people took on other services. As I said, Hayagriva edited. Umapati took notes on Swamiji's lectures. Gargamuni Greg sold incense. And devotees did different things. The first girl came, Judy Kozlovsky, that she later became initiated as Jadorani. And she was an artist, although she said she was the worst student in her class at college. And she started painting pictures for the Swami from photographs of gurus and Krishna. And he let her work in his worship room. She would paint with oils and tinkle the brush in a little glass of water. So her full-time occupation was to paint canvases of Krishna using a grid system, so it was exactly copied. And then he hung the paintings in the temple room. They were very crude at first, and he laughed at them, but said, "It is all right, you will gain experience by painting." So everyone had their service, and that was a key understanding. On off nights, when there wasn't a lecture in the kirtan other than Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Swamiji sat in his workroom, and he let guests and devotees come in and sit and ask questions, and he would answer questions by the hours and talk about Krishna, and he would talk about his boyhood in Calcutta, and he would range over all topics. It was so nice sitting in there and talking informally. But different street people used to come in who were eccentrics. Once a boy came in and said to Swamiji, "Right now I'm higher than you are. I am God." Swamiji paid his respects to this boy with his hands folded and said, "Please accept my obeisances. Now leave." That's how he treated God. I asked the question, I said, "What about the Western philosophers and writers that we used to read and we were so attached to? Did they have any God consciousness at all?" And he said, "Their sincerity was their God consciousness." I loved that answer. If he had said, "They're useless, they have no God consciousness at all," it would have been harder for me to take because I was so attached to them and loved following them. But that he gave them some credit for their sincerity made it easier for me to take. My first question that I asked him when I found him alone was, "Is there a state of spiritual advancement that you make from which you don't fall down?" And he answered with one word, "Yes." And that made a big impression on me, because I had tried to be good and not smoke and not have illicit sex, and I would be able to keep it up for a few weeks, but then I would fall down, and I wondered if it was ever possible to reach a platform where you didn't fall down. So he convinced me by his one word. And actually, since the first night I attended the temple, I stopped smoking marijuana and stopped illicit sex. So his influence was so powerful over me. One day I came from my work wearing my sport jacket and tie and shirt. I came at my lunch hour to buy the books, his 3 volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam. I found him alone with the Mott Street boys and some other boys, and he was talking philosophy as usual. I envied them because they didn't have any jobs. And I asked him, "I'd like to buy the books." So he got out the books, and he gave them to me. And I wanted to show off that I knew about reading books, and I said, "Are these your commentaries on the scriptures?" And he said, "Yes." So I said, "I'll take them." He said, "They're $6 each." I gave him a $20 bill, and he made a gesture to get some change, and I said, "That's all right, you can keep it." And then he looked at me and said in a deep voice, "Sit down." He wanted me to join with the others and listen to him. But I very quickly said, "Oh, I can't sit down, I'm only on my lunch hour. I have to get back to work." So he wasn't displeased. He looked up at me surprised and a little pleased. He saw that I wasn't a hippie, a good-for-nothing, that I was engaged in work, and he let me leave with a smile. I guess he thought he could engage me. So I read the Bhagavatams, and I found things in there that Swamiji wasn't even lecturing about in the Bhagavad Gita lectures. I read about the author of the Bhagavatam, Vyasadeva, being despondent despite writing so many Vedic literatures, and his spiritual master came to him and explained to him the reason why. So that resonated with me because I was a full-time writer, and I was despondent also. So one time I went to see the Swami when he was alone, and I said, I found that really interesting in your Bhagavatam about Vyasadeva being a writer and being despondent. And when I said that, he opened his eyes wide in appreciation that I was asking a question about an advanced topic. So that was the benefit of reading the books. One evening in his room on an off night, when it was crowded with people, he was talking about his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. We loved hearing that he had a spiritual master, and he told us about how he first met him, and how he was a follower of Gandhi and argued with his spiritual master. And we lapped it up. And then he told us a story about his spiritual master. He said when he was a young boy, just a toddler, he once ate a mango without offering it to God. And his father, the great Vaishnava Bhaktivinoda Thakur, scolded him for eating without offering the food. And the little boy said, I will never eat mango again in my life. And although he was just a little boy, he kept that vow for his whole life. When his disciples would offer him mango, he would say, no, I am an offender. And Prabhupada said, we couldn't appreciate this austerity of vow because we didn't know how delicious mangoes were. In India, they were considered the king of fruits. But you can't get any mangoes in America. So after he said that, I was in my office one day thinking about the Swamiji, and I thought about the mangoes, and I wondered if I could get him one. So I went to a grocery store on First Street, and I looked in the front and asked for any mangoes. They said, no, we don't have any, but we have a few in the freezer in the back, special items. So he took me in the back and he showed me some mangoes. They were small, but they were green and red and yellow, and they looked good and ripe. So they were $1 each, which was expensive. But I bought one, and I brought it to the Swami. He was very grateful, and he accepted it from me and thanked me. So that began a habit for me. Every day I bought a mango, and he would accept it. After a few weeks, I came in the afternoon, and I gave him my mango, and there were boys sitting there, unemployed as usual. And Swamiji took the mango and he said to me, very good boy. And he said it the way you would address a 7-year-old boy who was giving an apple to the teacher. So the Mott Street boys burst out laughing, and I blushed and I felt I had been the butt of a joke. Swamiji saw the situation and he said, no, this is love. This is Krishna consciousness. And I felt redeemed. Swamiji said he was going to legally incorporate the society. For months he had been referring to it as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. A man had told him, why don't you call it the International Society for God Consciousness? That's more acceptable to Westerners. And Swamiji said, no, Krishna consciousness. God is a weak, vague term. Krishna is more scientific and accurate. And if people don't know who Krishna is, then it's the duty of the Society for Krishna Consciousness to teach them. And he laughed and said, we'll call our society ISKCON. But it took money and a lawyer to incorporate a non-tax or a tax-exempt society. His casual follower from the Bowery, Carl Jurgens, had experience incorporating societies, and he had a lawyer. So he told his lawyer, a Jewish man named Steve Goldsmith, about the Swami on the Lower East Side. and he became fascinated with the idea of incorporating his society. So he came down to see the Swami, and he used to attend the lectures and kirtans. He was the only non-hippie in the audience. And he met with the Swami, and he brought his 2 children to lunch, and they liked the soup or dal. And they discussed together about Prabhupada's immigration status and what he wanted in his incorporation society. Then one night he came with an attaché case during the lecture and sat in the back with his shirt and tie and slacks.
The leadership of Krishna and make an experiment how you are becoming happy. We have just started this association, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and trying to preach the Krishna consciousness. If you kindly come and take advantage of this opportunity, it will be beneficial for both of us, because we have come here with a mission, and if you cooperate, you will be benefited.
And Swamiji introduced him into the lecture. He was lecturing about interpretations on the Bhagavad Gita and how they changed the meaning. And he said, just like our president, he called him, just like our president, Mr. Goldsmith, he's a lawyer. And he knows how lawyers can interpret law. There was a lawyer in Calcutta, and a law was passed by the government, and by his interpretation, he changed the whole thing around, and the government had to make a new law. So we don't want that kind of interpretation. Mr. Goldsmith, would you like to speak? And Mr. Goldsmith said, I should speak now? Swamiji said, yes. So he stood up, and that was the end of the lecture. And he came forward and he opened his thin attaché case and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He said, should I get the signatures now? And Swamiji said, yes. And he said, Don, Raphael, Michael, you can sign? I was shy and I held back. I didn't want to sign. Actually, most of the people who signed were the least committed. And they signed the papers without even reading them. It was technical, too. They were trustees for 1 year. And then there was a meeting, and they would change for trustees for a 2nd year. And there was a meeting, and there were new trustees for a 3rd year. So he gathered all these signatures and put them back in his attaché case. And we got incorporated. And we were now the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And Prabhupada wrote into it, Purposes of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And these are concise, philosophical preaching and sadhana points of the meaning of ISKCON. They're printed every month in Back to Godhead magazine, and you can read them there. After he incorporated ISKCON, Hayagriva wrote what he called a prospectus. And it was a little pamphlet that he printed. And it was written in language accessible to a Western audience, explaining what the International Society was and how people could benefit by it. So I really liked it. Swamiji approved of it. And I sent a copy to my parents in the mail. Then I phoned them after they had time to read it. And I was shocked to find that they were very upset. This was the first they heard of my involvement with the Swami and ISKCON. I talked to both my mother and father. And my father blasphemed Swamiji, called him a cheater, and these Swamis from India. They're good for nothing. And my mother said, you're a Catholic, you have no business associating with an Indian religious society. We don't want you to do this. If you continue to do this, we'll have nothing to do with you. I couldn't believe my ears. They were ready to disown me for being part of the Swami's movement, and I couldn't bear the insults my father was making toward the Swami. I said, we're just a peace and love movement, There's nothing wrong with what we're doing. I said, we're following the same principles as the Catholic Church. No, you're not. So I hung up. I was angry too, but I was very sad. And I cried a little. And then I went to see the Swami, and I told him that my parents were so angry, they said they'd disown me if I stayed in ISKCON. And I thought he would preach to me about it, but he didn't say much. He just said a few words. But he had a twinkle in his eye. And later he wrote me a letter and said, I am your eternal father. Your other father is immaterial. So I know it's good if devotees can make peace with their parents after they join Krishna consciousness movement. And Prabhupada likes that. But in my case, he didn't ask me to make peace with my parents. And I thought of myself as Narada Muni, who as a young boy lost his parents and had to take shelter of the sages and the Bhaktivedantas. I did want to make peace with my parents, but they stuck to their guns on the disowning. 20 years later, I called my mother on the phone, and she said, where have you been? I said, all over the world, but I didn't want to hide. I said, with the Hare Krishna movement. And she said, real blunt, as long as you're with them, we don't want anything to do with you. And the conversation lasted about 5 minutes. I said, but I'm your son. When children grow up, they take different paths, but they still remain part of the family. She said, all right, I understand, but we don't want anything to do with you. So they were so hardcore that there was no chipping away at their hard hearts. I want to talk about the first initiation. It was in August on Janmashtami. There was no permission required, not even from Swamiji. He just announced the principles, and anyone who wanted could get initiated. In other words, he didn't ask me would I like to get initiated. He just put it out there. And he said we should get beads to chant on. He had Tulsi beads, but Tulsi beads weren't available in New York City. So we went to Tandy's bead and craft shop and got these big red wooden beads. I remember I went alone. I walked 14 blocks up to 14th Street, and I chanted all the way. And I bought my big red beads, and then I tied a knot in between each bead and made a circle of 108 beads with the head bead, and he taught us how to chant on them. Prabhupada had morning meetings in addition to evening meetings, and in the morning meeting he chanted one round on beads with us. We would have a kirtan in the morning for 20 minutes, and it was a softer kirtan because we didn't want to disturb the tenant upstairs. And he said, chant softly. But the cartels were ringing, and the man upstairs was intolerant and irate. And eventually, water started dripping down from the ceiling. And what the man did was he peeled away the caulking from his bathtub. So there was an opening, and he poured water down there, and it dripped through the floor and through the ceiling of the storefront. But we were undaunted. We continued our morning programs. And after the kirtan, Swamiji said, chant one round. And he would chant, and we would chant with him. But I'm talking about the initiation. He told us that we would have it on Janmashtami, and he told us how to observe Janmashtami. He wanted us to stay in the storefront all day and fast. He said if we couldn't fast, we could take some fruit out of his refrigerator. But it was really hard staying in that little storefront with nothing to do except chant on our beads. We asked him to come down, and he was flattered to come down and read from his manuscript of Bhagavad Gita, which he read to us for hours, and that helped our restlessness. Michael Grant's wife, Jan, or his girlfriend at that point, said she had to go home and feed her cats. And Swamiji said, "No, stay. We all have to stay in the temple today." She said, "No, I can't." And she rebelled and she went out the door and shut the door behind her. He shook his head. So we understood he really meant business. And we stayed in our places and leaned against the wall and paced and hung out and listened to him read the Bhagavad Gita. The initiation was in the evening. I heard the boys talking about it, and they took it very casually. They would say to each other, "Are you going to get initiated?" And one would say, "I don't know. Are you going to get initiated?" I thought I might take a chance. So they were very casual about it. I thought I might take a chance. If I have nothing else to do, I might get initiated. But I took it as a very heavy thing. I had been in the Navy for 2 years, and I experienced that as a prison. And now for 2 years I was enjoying freedom and independence, living on the Lower East Side by myself. And I was reluctant to give up my freedom and make a lifetime commitment to the Swami. I didn't feel ready to surrender. But in reality, I had already surrendered to him and accepted him as my guru. But I decided to skip the first initiation. So without anyone noticing, toward the evening, I went out the door and I went to my apartment. And there I spent the evening typing his manuscript. So I remained his follower, but I exempted myself from the first initiation. I stayed up typing. The next morning, I went to him with my typing, a big stack of papers. I was a good typist, and if I made a mistake, I corrected it, and I gave him perfect copies. He used to take them, and he wouldn't proofread them, but he looked them over cursorily and said, "Good job." So I gave him this stack of papers. As soon as I knocked on the door, he was alone, and he said, "Oh, hello, Steve. You didn't come to the initiation yesterday." I said, "No, I didn't. I stayed home and typed." He said, "That's all right." And then he said, "You have some typing for me?" And I went over and sat beside him and gave him the typing, and he looked at it. And he said, "Good job." And then he reached over and he gave me some grapes, a little handful of grapes. And I took them and I thought to myself, I stayed up all night and all I get is a few grapes. And then the phone rang. He had a phone in his room for a while, until it got intolerable. And he answered it and he spoke a few moments, something about a marriage. Then he hung up and he turned to me and said, "I'm going to hold a wedding tomorrow of 2 of my students. I would like to invite you." And this is just what I needed, personal attention. I craved personal attention and responded to it very much. Swamiji had daily lunches, but then on Sunday, he cooked a special feast and served it in the same place in his room. And he did the cooking. And he cooked sweet rice and halva and Puspanjali rice, yellow with cheese balls. So I didn't think I was invited. I was very careful not to intrude on the Swami. So one Sunday after his morning class, I sat out on the stoop, on the curb rather, of 26 2nd Avenue, and I was looking down the street and trying to think what I would do today. And he was still in the storefront and he saw me and he asked the boy to bring me in. I went up to him and he said, "Do you have any work today?" He knew that I was a worker. I said, "No, I have off today." He said, "We have a Sunday feast every Sunday. I'm inviting you to come." And that's what I loved, the personal invitation. So he personally invited me to the wedding also. And then, after being invited to the wedding, he gave me some more stack of papers for typing. And I was about to take my leave. And he said to me, "This taking of typing is not mechanical. It's not automatic. But if you love me, I'll love you. And when he said those words, it had a tremendous effect on me. I was very moved emotionally and deeply personally. I felt so happy. It broke through all my barriers of not wanting to surrender to him. Foolish things, like his being an Indian and his being an old man. And I thought love was a one-way street, that he should love me, but not that I had to love him back. But now he said, if you love me, I'll love you. And I was so happy. I ran out of that apartment and down the stairs in complete bliss. And I was a changed man. Those words were very important to me. I went to the wedding, and there was a feast. There was a newcomer who came to the feast named Bruce Scharf. And he said that the samosas at the feast convinced him to become a devotee. But I was envious of the initiates. We didn't have bead bags, but we wore our beads around our neck in 2 strands, these big red wooden beads. And they were calling each other by their new Sanskrit names. And I was green with envy. I thought I really had missed out. So as soon as I could, I went to the Swami in his room and I said, can I get initiated too? And he said, well, you'll have to be a vegetarian. I said, I already am. I had been a vegetarian for 6 months. He said, yes, you can get initiated. We're having another initiation at an auspicious occasion. In 2 weeks, it's Srimati Radharani's appearance day, and you can get initiated then. There are a couple of others who are ready. So on September 23rd, 1966, on Radhastami, I got initiated. Prabhupada told us a little bit about Srimati Radharani. He said on Krishna's appearance day, we have to fast all day because Krishna is hard and strong. But Radharani is very tender, so we only fast until noon. And then he gave a sutra about Radharani, which to this day I love. He said, Radharani is the best devotee of Krishna because she loves him the most. And we had our initiation. There were 3 of us. There was me, there was Keith, who had been incarcerated in Bellevue during the first initiation and couldn't attend. And there was Chuck, Achyutananda, who had taken a vacation from Krishna consciousness during the week of the first initiation and missed it. So the 3 of us got initiated in his apartment, and he built a fire. And he chanted on each of our beads 1 round before giving us our beads, a wonderful custom. And then he asked me to bow down in front of him. So I put my head at his feet, and he said, repeat after me. And he repeated his pranam mantra, Nama, and I said Nama, and he said Om, I said Om, Vishnu, Vishnu, Pradaya, Pradaya, Krishna, Krishna, Prasaya, Bhutale, Bhutale, Srimate, Bhakti, Bhakti. And when I said the word Bhakti, I had a real emotional response. I felt I was plunging down, 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 into a swoon of devotion at his lotus feet. It was very mystical and sweet. And then I came up, and he gave me my beads, and he gave a lecture. And in the lecture, for the first time, he mentioned Guru Dakshin. It was the first time I heard the word. And he said, when the spiritual master gives you knowledge, you have a debt to pay to him. And what you have to pay back is, you have to tell people about Krishna. And I thought, wow, this is an obligation. I just got initiated, and it means I have to preach about Krishna. So I asked him the next day what was the meaning of my name. He said, your name means the inner reality of truth. It was a little abstract, but I accepted it. Satsvarupa. One time, shortly after that, I came into his room where others were gathered, and he said, oh, here comes the truth personified. And that made a little more sense. So the others accepted me as having a spiritual name and being initiated. Another thing that happened during that summer was we got an invitation from the United Nations to attend a peace prayer vigil. Different religious groups were gathering in front of the United Nations building, and saying prayers for peace. So we, as a religious group, were invited, and the Swamiji wanted to take the opportunity. All the boys went by bus up to the UN building, and Prabhupada got a ride in a car. It was a beautiful summer morning, and I still remember Swamiji standing up and giving a lecture and the breeze blowing his robes. And he gave a lecture about the peace formula, how there can't be peace unless you accept Krishna as the proprietor and the object of all sacrifices and the owner of everything. And then when he was finished his speech, we got ready to pray. We took out our cartels and we started crashing them. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. And the UN representative ran out and said, Stop. This is a silent prayer vigil. So he stopped our kirtan, and we all had to sit down in the plaza and chant japa instead of chanting. So we chanted for about an hour, and that was our prayer vigil. And a picture appeared of us in the New York Post, and they referred to him as Swami Krishna. And Prabhupada looked at the picture, and there was a picture of me there with my head down. And he said, Oh, you chant like this with your head down? Swamiji said he wanted us to go out and chant in public. We got permission to chant on Sundays in Tompkins Square Park from 2 to 5. We had an old oriental rug that someone had given us, so we rolled it up, and 2 boys carried it on their shoulders. And we took our instruments and walked the 5 blocks to Tompkins Square Park, the boys and the Swami leading the way. People, mostly Puerto Rican wise guys, jeered at us from their stoops. But Swami was unaffected. We were intimidated and scared, but we stayed close to him. We went to the park, and we laid out the rug by the oak tree there. And Swami sat down on the edge of the rug, and he took out this one-headed bongo drum. This was the only drum he had. He had written when he was uptown to Satsvarupa Maharaja asking her to send him a Madranga. And he wrote to a godbrother, but nobody sent him a Madranga. But he played this drum like a Madranga with one hand. He was very strong. His health was very good. And he chanted. We had 3 hours to chant. And he chanted for an hour and a half, non-stop, leading the chanting. People gathered around, dozens of people, old Ukrainian ladies, young kids on their bicycles ran right up close to us, and then hippies came with a more interested spirit, and some of them had wooden recorders that they played, and someone had a flute. A guy came by with a saxophone and started playing, and Allen Ginsberg was out, and he came by, and he chanted with us, and a news reporter came from the New York Times and interviewed Allen Ginsberg. He said, Don't interrupt a man when he's worshiping. We were so thrilled to be outdoors with the Swami chanting, and a few boys got up and danced the Swami step. It wasn't the kind of dancing that they do now in ISKCON. It was a very sedate movement where you just put one foot in front of the other and held your hands up like Lord Chaitanya. So a few boys danced around, and Stradish, who was Stanley, gave out pamphlets. And the hours went by and we just chanted and chanted. And people joined us and got into it and were shaking their heads. And Swamiji just rode on top of it all, leading the chanting in a strong voice and thumping on his drum. After an hour and a half, he stopped and he got up and he stood by the tree and he gave a lecture. He said there are 3 levels of consciousness. There's material consciousness, intellectual consciousness, and transcendental consciousness. And this Krishna consciousness is transcendental. It was a short speech, and he spoke in a soft voice. Not many people heard him. He didn't speak too long. Then he sat down again and went for another hour and a half, chanting. And we were the spectacular occasion in the park that day. There was a group in the distance. Guys were playing on the conga drums, but we drowned them out. And we celebrated Krishna in the Hare Krishna mantra. When we were finished, about 20 people followed us back to the storefront, It was just like the Pied Piper. They just spontaneously kept with us. They didn't want to leave us. And Swamiji let them come into the storefront, and he had sweet rice ready. And he gave out sweet rice in little paper cups. And everybody ate the sweet rice, and he gave an impromptu lecture about the chanting. And after that, for some days, we got more attendance in the meetings from our exposure in the park. And after that, every week we went at Sunday from 2 to 5 and chanted. And we got newspaper coverage. The next day in the New York Times, there was an article with a picture. And it said, Swami's flock chants in park to find ecstasy. And there was a picture of Brahmananda and Achyutananda dancing, and the Swami sitting on the floor playing a drum. And there was another article in the Loki Hippie newspaper, the East Village Other, and the whole front page had a big photo of Swamiji standing under the oak tree giving a lecture, and big headlines, "Save Earth Now!" and a long article about ISKCON. It said, somebody says God is dead, somebody says he exists in a sugar cube, but a Swami from India on the Lower East Side says he exists in a chant, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, and went on to describe Swami and our activities. And we read it to him and he loved it. We had to explain some of the hippie words like acid, pothead, fuzz, but when he heard the explanations, he dug it. He was hip. And he thought it was really good. And then another newspaper article came out shortly afterwards in the National Enquirer, and it was titled, New Indian Religion Gets You Higher Than LSD. And there were pictures of the Swami and the devotees. Prabhupada liked this newspaper coverage so much that he had the 3 newspapers printed up 100 copies each, and he devised a program called the Trustees Program. He said we should each go to a respectable person and show them these newspaper clippings and ask them to become a trustee of ISKCON for $40 a month. They could get his books and any future books that came out. So he deployed us to find respectable people. I didn't know any respectable people, except my sister. Her husband worked on Wall Street as a stock analyst, and they lived in Westchester. So I made a date to see them, and I took the newspaper clippings and went up. I rode the train up, and on the way I read Prabhupada's little booklet from India for the first time, the little pale blue book that he printed there, called Easy Journey to Other Planets. And I had a miraculous experience reading it. The highest ecstasy I ever had reading Prabhupada's books before or since. The spiritual world opened to me, and I saw the Vaikuntha planets and the spiritual world, and I read it with complete submission. And I got high reading it and believing that Krishna was the truth, and that Krishna consciousness was the only way. So when I arrived at my sister's, I was really fired up and transcendental, but I wasn't a good preacher. I was really fanatic. I preached to her strong. I said, these bodies are just lumps of flesh and blood, and we shouldn't use sex except to have children, and we shouldn't eat meat, and we shouldn't smoke. And I told her about the Swami and how wonderful he was, and she said, oh, Stevie, now you're into another thing, because I used to get into things and then get out of them. I used to be an Elvis Presley fan, and then I quit that. Then I was a rock and roll fan, and then I quit that. Then I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and then I quit that. And then I got into jazz. So she thought, this is just another phase for you, another kick, and you'll give it up. But I didn't give it up, and I preached to her, and she was a little uneasy and unsubmissive. I was so fanatical. Then her husband came home, Tommy, and then I made the pitch for $40 a month. Look at the newspaper clippings. And they looked at them and they weren't so impressed, even by the New York Times, the references to LSD. And they said, definitely no, we're not going to become trustees. We're not going to give $40 a month. So when I saw their finality, I looked at my watch and I said, all right, I'm going to leave now. And my sister got alarmed and she said, wait a minute. We listened to your preaching about ISKCON. Now let's be normal people and just talk about other things. I said, no, I can't. If you don't want to become trustees, I have nothing to say. And I got up to leave, and my brother-in-law drove me to the train station. On the way, I told him, this isn't fanatical. This is called transcendental loving service. And he said, yeah. And I got back on time. Swamiji was still up. He hadn't gone to bed. And I told him, Swamiji, I failed to make trustees of my sister and brother-in-law. And he was happy with me. And he said, that's all right. You tried. And I've never seen my sister since. So those are memories from the summer of 1966. As I said, this presentation will be first seen by an audience around June of 2016. But the 50th anniversary year continued, and the Krishna consciousness movement continued through 1966 through the winter. We made a record with the Happening label of Prabhupada and the boys chanting in December. But then in December, Prabhupada started talking of getting letters from Mukunda in California, of starting a temple in San Francisco. And he talked seriously of going there. He said that Mukunda had told him the hippie movement was even bigger in California than in New York. And they had arranged something called a mantra rock dance, with rock bands playing, and Prabhupada would be chanting with Allen Ginsberg. Brahmananda expressed it best. He said, we were shocked to hear that Swamiji would leave. We thought that Krishna consciousness would always stay on the Lower East Side and never leave, never go beyond, what to speak of leaving New York City. We thought this was it, that it would stay here eternally. And that was our idea, that the Hare Krishna movement would always stay at 26 Second Avenue and never leave. So we even came to Prabhupada and expressed our displeasure at the idea of his leaving, and we thought that the devotees in San Francisco didn't know how to take care of him. We didn't like the idea of the mantra rock dance. And he patiently explained to us that his mission went beyond New York City, and he had a desire to spread it all over the world. And so we were pacified, and he left us. He sent us a letter saying that I know you're missing me, but there are two understandings of the spiritual master. One is called Vapu and one is called Vani. Vapu is the personal association and the Vani is the teachings. And the teachings are more important. So just follow my teachings and I will be with you. This pacified us. But actually, here we are observing the 50th anniversary of ISKCON. But the fact is, ISKCON has grown in 50 years from a one-temple movement to a movement that is huge, spread all over the world with many temples, and millions of books have been distributed, and there are now hundreds and thousands of devotees. And Krishna consciousness is very influential in the world. So Prabhupada would like to say that those were happy days in 1966, and they certainly were. But these are happy days now in 2016, and we have lived to see the movement grow into a worldwide religion. Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya